так воно промигнуло, що я вспоминаю от воєнні годи.
He murdered at least 52 people, and for years the Soviet state refused to believe a serial killer could even exist.
This is the story of Andrei Chikatilo, schoolteacher, family man, and cannibal.
You're listening to Psycho Killer, shocking true crime stories. I'm Jacques Morrell, a retired major crime detective.
And I'm Simon Ford, a journalist, writer, and sometime academic.
Now, steel yourself, because what follows is almost beyond belief.
He preyed on the innocent. He murdered without mercy. And for over a decade, the Soviet system helped cover his tracks.
In a crumbling empire where truth was suppressed and those in power feared scandal, one of the most prolific serial killers in history went undetected, again and again. In this episode, we take you to Soviet-era Russia, where a soft-spoken teacher named Andrei Chikatilo, nicknamed the Butcher of Rostov, slaughtered over 50 women and children.
His crimes shocked the world. His trial was pure theatre, and the psychology behind his madness is still debated today.
Внимание! Внимание! Слушайте, говорит Москва.
He was born in blood, bone, and hunger.
Andrei Chikatilo entered the world in 1936, deep in the heart of Stalin's Soviet Union, a land choking under the weight of its own ambition.
This was Yabluchny, a tiny Ukrainian village near the Russian border. At first glance, endless fields, dirt roads, a few cattle. But beneath the surface, the earth had been scarred by something far darker than the landscape could show.
The year of Chikatilo's birth fell in the shadow of Stalin's first 5-year plan, a brutal campaign of forced collectivization. The idea? Industrialize at lightning speed. The cost? Millions of lives.
Ukraine, where Chikatilo was born, bore the brunt of this policy. Stalin's grain quotas stripped villages bare, and in 1932-33, the country descended into a government-orchestrated famine. It became known as the Holodomor, literally death by hunger.
And it wasn't just hunger, it was despair. Cannibalism was reported. Children disappeared. Entire families perished. Chikatilo's own mother, Anna, reportedly told him that his older brother Stepan had been abducted and eaten by neighbours during the famine.
There's a debate over whether Stepan ever existed. No birth record, no grave. But the psychological impact of being raised with that story, of being told your own sibling was devoured to survive, well, it leaves a mark. Especially on a child already growing up in fear and deprivation.
Andrei's father, Roman, was a soldier in the Red Army during World War II, what Russians called the Great Patriotic War. He was captured by the Nazis and spent time in a prisoner of war camp. When he returned, he was labelled a traitor by the state for the crime of being caught alive.
That stigma followed the family. They were shunned, starved, humiliated. Chikatilo grew up in a one-room hut. He wet the bed. He was painfully shy, bullied at school, humiliated over his short-sightedness, his impotence, his failures.
A cocktail of personal weakness, sexual shame, and inherited trauma, all of it steeped in the cruelty of the Soviet machine. The system didn't just crush people, it deformed them.
Was Andrei Chikatilo born evil? No. He was born into a world of silence, hunger and fear, and that world shaped the monster he would become.
Coming up, we follow Chikatilo from rural obscurity to Soviet schoolteacher and into the shadows where his double life began.
When we say the butcher of Rostov, we're not being dramatic. This wasn't a tabloid nickname. It's a brutal understatement. Andrei Chikatilo's crimes weren't just prolific, they were monstrous, in the most literal sense.
Between 1978 and 1990, he killed at least 52 women and children across the Soviet Union. But it's not just the number that's shocking, it's the method, the cruelty, and the utter lack of remorse.
Let's go back to the beginning. His first known murder was in 1978, a 9-year-old girl named Yelena Zakotnova. He lured her into an abandoned house, pretending to show her some imported chewing gum. Once inside, he attacked her, stabbing her repeatedly, slashing her abdomen, and mutilating her genitals. She died slowly and alone.
And what's particularly disturbing is what came next. That murder awakened something in him, a hunger. In later confessions, Chikatilo admitted that the stabbing gave him sexual gratification. He would later say, "I was like a mad wolf. I was seeing red."
For the next few years, he kept a low profile, but in 1981 he resumed killing. His next victims were vagrants, runaways and street children, kids no one was going to report missing quickly, and he knew it.
He used the Soviet transport network, particularly trains, to travel between cities, drifting like a ghost across the vast expanse of the USSR. He'd spot his victims at stations, bus stops, or markets. Often they were lured with food, promises of shelter, or vague paternal kindness.
In 1984, he entered one of his most active and vicious periods. In that single year, he murdered 15 people. Each killing followed a grotesque ritual. He would beat them, stab them, often dozens of times. He mutilated genitals, gouged out eyes, bit off nipples and tongues. It's believed he removed the eyes of his victims because he believed they held his image, a superstition common in Russian folklore.
Let's not gloss over this. These were crimes of overkill. One victim, Irina Karabelnikova, just 19 years old, was stabbed 40 times. Her eyes were removed, her chest mutilated. Another, Lyubov Biryuk, just 13, was lured into the woods near Novocherkassk. Her body was found with a severed tongue and deep bite marks.
He killed boys too. Alexei Kobotovich, 11, Sergei Kuzmin, 15, Ivan Bilovets, 13. Sometimes he would sexually assault them before their death, sometimes after.
In many cases, the injuries were frenzied and targeted. He would stab his victims in the eyes, face, and groin. He told investigators that the stabbing itself, the physical violence, was more arousing than any actual sexual contact.
In one police report, the case of Natalia Poklistova, aged 12, the forensic pathologist noted more than 30 stab wounds, concentrated around the chest, genitals and eyes. There was no attempt to hide the body, just a display of carnage left in a wooded area near the tracks.
He operated during an era when the Soviet police systems were not set up to handle serial crimes. There was no centralized database. Information didn't flow across regional borders. Many of his murders were classified as unsolved assaults or blamed on known mental patients.
In fact, at one point, investigators arrested and executed Alexander Kravchenko, a local man falsely accused of the 1978 murder of Yelena Zatkovnova, Chikatilo's first victim.
An innocent man executed while the real killer continued his spree.
In fact, Chikatilo confessed to 56 murders, though he was convicted of 52. Many of his victims were never officially identified. Their remains were found in shallow graves, ravaged by animals, scattered near railway lines and in forests.
The violence was frenzied, but the planning cold, methodical. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question. Was Andrei Chikatilo insane or just evil?
We'll come to that, but first, let's look at how he got away with it for so long.
Добрый вечер.
Здравствуйте, товарищи.
There is no crime in the Soviet Union. That was the dogma, a central propaganda pillar, a belief so entrenched that for over a decade, while bodies piled up across forests, railway sidings and rural paths, Soviet officials refused to admit what was staring them in the face, that a serial killer was at large.
To even use the phrase serial killer was considered ideologically dangerous. It was a concept that belonged to the decadent, decaying West. The USSR was, after all, the workers' paradise. And in paradise, monsters weren't supposed to exist.
And so the response to Chikatilo's spree was predictable, a combination of denial, mishandling, and brutal scapegoating. At least 15 people were wrongly arrested during the investigation. Several were beaten into false confessions, and one man, as we've heard, was executed for a crime Chikatilo had committed.
His name was Alexander Kravchenko. He had a record, yes, a violent past. So when 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova was found murdered in 1978, he was a convenient suspect. Interrogated under duress, convicted with scant evidence, and shot. The real killer walked free.
But that was just the beginning. As more bodies surfaced in the 1980s, always in similar circumstances, always showing the same patterns of mutilation, the KGB was reluctant to share data across oblasts. There was no unified investigative bureau. Each regional police force worked in isolation. Information bottlenecked. Leads were lost. Patterns weren't seen.
And then, of course, there's the issue of forensic science. It was rudimentary then. DNA testing didn't exist. Even blood typing was poorly applied. Chikatilo himself was blood type A, but due to a rare condition called secretor status incompatibility, his semen was typed as AB, a flaw that confused investigators for years and cleared him in an early arrest.
Yes, you heard that right. In 1984, Chikatilo was arrested for suspicious behaviour at a Rostov bus terminal. He had scratches on his face, blood on his coat, and was carrying a knife and lengths of rope. He fitted the suspect profile, but when his blood didn't match the semen from crime scenes, he was released.
Think about that. 1984 was Chikatilo's most prolific period of killing, and he was right there, in custody, and they let him go.
It's a moment of almost unbelievable irony, but it speaks to something deeper, the chronic dysfunction of the late Soviet system. By the mid-1980s, the USSR was a crumbling edifice. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986 showed the world how layers of denial, bureaucratic inertia, and political pressure could blind the system to a ticking time bomb.
Andrei Chikatilo was the criminal version of that bomb, hidden in plain sight. The system wasn't designed to stop someone like him. It was designed to pretend he didn't exist.
Let's be clear, this wasn't just about policing, it was about politics. Careers were at stake. Admitting that a sexual sadist was slaughtering children across the Soviet Union would have been seen as a failure of socialism. So instead of alerting the public, they kept it quiet. Instead of coordinating across agencies, they kept investigations localized. And instead of empowering experts, they silenced or ignored them.
One investigator, Mikhail Fetisov, later said, "We were trying to fight the devil with our hands tied behind our backs. No data sharing, no psychological profiling, no permission to use the media. All we had was gut instinct and shoe leather."
Another missed opportunity? The use of profilers. Soviet criminal psychology was decades behind the West, but there was one man, Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, who created the country's first psychological profile of Chikatilo. His analysis helped crack the case, but his work was initially ridiculed by party hardliners.
It wasn't until 1990, 12 years after the first murder, that Chikatilo was finally arrested for good. But by then, 52 lives had been extinguished. Perhaps more, we may never know. This was the human cost of a state unwilling or unable to face the reality of evil.
And so, after more than a decade of bungled investigations and innocent men going to prison, the butcher of Rostov was finally behind bars. But what came next would be almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves. In part 2 of Psycho Killer, the Butcher of Rostov, we'll take you inside Chikatilo's chilling confession, explore his twisted psyche, and witness the surreal circus of his Soviet trial. Subscribe now so you don't miss the conclusion. And if you want to support what we do, join us on Patreon. You'll get early access, bonus content, and help us bring you more shocking stories like this. That's next week on Psycho Killer, shocking true crime stories.